So Abdul-Baha's tablets on personal spiritual development has to do with his commentary on the Surah of Rome, or Rum, which is Byzantium, and the throne of the Byzantine Roman empires in Moscow. So these crises that happen at the international war level are also going to be the cause of us overcoming the insistent self. This is why these things, although tragic and horrific in destruction, are considered to be good things. And we're in a 7-month period of decision right now, the Valley of Decision, which is the Valley of Hamongog, where they're burying the dead for 7 months since the date of Abdul-Baha's shrine fire that brings us to International Peace Day on September 22nd of this year. If we start from February 24th, we start from the shrine fire, it brings us to the day that Shoghi Effendi was martyred, I believe, in November of this next year. So we have this 7-month period we're in right now where we have to take this seriously. All the people of the world, like when Jonah went to the city of Nineveh, need to put on, ashes and sackcloth and turn to God the way they understand it through Jesus, Moses, Muhammad, Bahaullah, the Bab, Buddha, Krishna, Zoroaster, the indigenous traditions, and say, oh Lord, give us the strength, the way they understand God, to elect the Supreme Tribunal correctly. So a Bahai, Abdul-Baha says, is simply a human being who loves all the people of the world and loves humanity. And so we can see that by that criteria, the majority of people are already Bahai as of 2001, the year Mustagab. The Bab and Baha'u'llah have explained in their writings, and the Bab in his books of prophecy, the Persian Arabic Bayan, and the books of names, the Guma Azma and the Katabi Azma, which is the largest single text written in religious history. It's over 6,000 pages, that these things prophesy this. And it says that if this occurs, if this event occurs in the year Mustagath, all of the people will be saved. And that's kind of the thing that's going on here. It says zeal for his father's house will consume him. The house is this international tribunal. And this is what's consuming our time and our energy, is to get the people to be spiritually mature enough to elect this. I was shocked when I was growing up that slavery was only outlawed within less than 100 years of my birth, and that we still had a civil rights problem. And I didn't understand why they had a glass ceiling when it came to men and women in the United States. These things were foreign to me in my nature, in my own understanding. And I'm not going to conform to them. We're consumed by spreading knowledge to overcome these things. When the United Nations Charter was put together to uphold the Kellogg-Briand International Peace Covenant of 1928, the Russians of that time were communists. They were atheistic. So God was never invoked in the charter of the UN. This is another problem, or the creator of the universe. Any endeavor that we go to undertake where we don't turn to God and ask for strength and protection fails. When they built the ship, the Titanic, they said it was the ship that God couldn't sink. So he sank it. And the Bahais believed that they had this infallible guidance, that there was no way the Baha'i world, which had become huge by the time of Shoghi Effendi, with 6 million adherents throughout the world, could fail. But when they followed Ria Khanum, who is the successor to Muhammad Ali and Mirza Yahya, this imbued the entire community with the poison of the insistent self. And now this has faded away to the most part, and people are seeing the grievous error that they've fallen into. And the reason it's grievous error, it's an error that brings great grief. The breaking of the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact and the inability to implement the principles of Baha'u'llah properly, so that we can have an international union of the nations to solve problems and prevent war from happening in the first place, was never set up correctly. And look at the grief and the grievous error of this crisis in the Ukraine. So in other words, why is it we're not mature enough to end war and slavery and poverty and ignorance and the destruction of the environment and these health crises? This is an abomination. Human beings that are adults should be able to cooperate together internationally and collectively as a group. Now, because of the good things that have happened since the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 and the setting up of the United Nations and the IMF system, that was all set up during the ministry of Shoghi Effendi, and Mason Ramey was working on this. When Maria Khanum broke the covenant and separated from the Holy Family by abandoning Abdul-Baha's son Mason and rejecting the Universal House of Justice that was already established in its appointed phase by Shoghi Effendi in 1951, this is why the United Nations and this current system has collapsed. If we were the House of Justice accepted by the Bahai State Israel court law in 63, and we still had our office at the United Nations, we'd be talking against all of the errors that lead to grief in these venues, and the guidance would have been given to the people. The Bahais are spiritual and religious. It's a spiritual government of education. And in the tablet of the art of governance, the Risala Saise, Abdul-Baha explains that religious leaders like us and spiritual people like the Bahais, we just give what we understand to be what God has revealed as the guidance to the rulers and the leaders of the world. We have nothing to say with how those things should be implemented and carried out. They're the wise ones in the echelon of government, the same way there's wise ones in agriculture and medicine and healing and art and music and science, that those are their skill sets. Our skill set is to provide the spiritual energy for people to become a better scientist, a better artist, a better agriculturalist, a better healer, the best that they can be, and the best governance. So in 1980, the establisher of the Baha'i faith, the seventh angel, prophesied of in the book Some Answered Questions, from which the main group in Haifa had removed the seventh angel prophecy from that sacred scripture approved by Abdul-Baha. He, with the other elders of the Baha'i faith that were loyal to the appointed successors in the Holy Family during the days of the grandson of Abdul-Baha's presidency of the House of Justice, wrote and the indictment, and it indicts the people of the world and the military industrial complex and the leaders of the clergy of the 7 apostate world religions, including apostate Baha'i. They indicted them for breaking the covenant. This was issued in 1980. In 2003, after the Gulf War II, the current president of the Universal House of Justice fixed their seal to this to implement the indictment in 2003. And a special delegate hand-delivered the indictment to Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State of the United States during Clinton's administration, in the city of Aspen, Colorado, where a lot of these ones meet to consult on world affairs and things like this. And Madeleine Albright had a huge, tremendous spiritual transformation through her exposure to the guidance that the Baha'is under the provisions of the covenant and the Universal House of Justice that's legitimate had been giving since the 1990s. And she passed on recently during the Ukraine crisis, and this happened for a reason that she's being talked about right now. And she came forward and said that unless we invoke God, the creator, the spirit, in our international affairs and documents, asking God to protect us in our endeavor. Nothing more than that. Not saying it's Jewish or Christian or Muslim or Baha'i or Buddhist or indigenous or whatever, but acknowledging the source of the cause of causes and asking for this protection that these international problems will not be resolved. So we've been able to be very influential in educating people to become the perfect governors and administrators that they need to be when it comes to governing worldly material affairs. These people who are in charge of worldly material affairs will remain in charge of worldly and material affairs. Ours, according to the Art of Governance by Abdulbaha, is a guidance by which they learn war no more. We are not going to interfere in how the governments are going to implement these preventative measures to eliminate war and to enforce and uphold the International Peace Pact of the Covenant of Peace of 1928. We're coming up to the centenary of the International Peace Pact of 1928 in 2028. The Baha'i Covenant is the Covenant of 1921, and we just came up to the centenary of that, the 100-year anniversary, and it ended with a fire burning down the shrine of Abdulbaha, who's the initiator of the century of the covenant. Do we want to see a world conflagration fire at the before or by the centenary of the International Peace Pact covenant that's been broken by 2028? We are in a valley of decision. It mentions 7 years in Ezekiel 37, 38, 39, and it mentions 7 months. And we're in the 7-month valley of decision now during this 7-year crisis period. And humanity needs to become spiritualized. They don't need to convert to the quote unquote Baha'i religion. In fact, Bahaullah has stated, as quoted by Showgi Effendi in his letters, The World Order Bahaullah, that people shouldn't convert to another religion like Baha'i. Instead, it says that when they hear this message, they should go back and rededicate themselves to the indigenous faith of their ancestral tradition. If it's Judaism, then they should be attracted to the truth of the spirit of the soul, loving God through that perspective, and then convert to it again and consecrate themselves to that, to God as revealed by Moses and then the Hebrew prophets. Same as if they're Muslims. They should get back to the roots of Islam. They should go back and understand that all of the Islamic sects have their point of unity in Imam Jafar al-Sadiq. And they should go back and realize that Muhammad's take on what Islam was is different than Omar's interpretation. They should go back to the fundamental roots of the Holy Quran, the Prophet as a living example and a noble example, and the way their thinking is founded by the teachings of the founder of the faith, Jafar al-Sadiq. If they're Christian, they should go back to their New Testament and go back directly to a relationship between them and the one true invisible God as revealed by Jesus Christ and explained by the prophecies of his apostles and disciples for the truth of the second coming. So all of these religions have prophesied a day when humanity would be spiritually mature enough to manage its global affairs. It's child's play. It's child's play to have a fight playing King of the Hill on a dirt mound. That game is so much fun when you're like 10 years old and maybe 12 or 13, like 8 to 15. Somebody goes on top of a hill and then the other people run up there and try to push them off and they stay on top. It's like this big fight that you have, and it's a game. And okay, somebody might get hurt a little bit, but it's all in good fun and they enjoy it like a soccer game or a football game. When a nation state decides to conquer the whole world to be the one country that rules the other countries, this creates this horrible, devastating, bloody war, the destruction of families, and the heart-wrenching experiences we all feel because we're all connected. It's spiritually mature to accept the fact that we're all connected and we're all going to taste death. Therefore, why are we here? We're here to care for each other, to take care of the planet so it's clean and healthy, to have high technology so we can communicate, so we can have trade and commerce throughout all the cultures and diversity of religions and traditions, so we can get to know one another, because we are the hidden treasure, and individuals are. And individuals are in these cultures, and these cultures are treasure troves that have been developed by individuals who were reflecting the rays of the Holy Spirit from the manifestations of God previously, such as Muhammad, Moses, and Christ. The prophet Muhammad is not the seal of the manifestations of God. He's the seal of the prophets. In other words, the day of prophecy is over. We don't need any more prophets to prophesy the coming of the kingdom. The kingdom is here. This is the day of fulfillment. Muhammad sealed this. Because he's the seal of the prophecy cannot be changed. The message of God is inviolable. It cannot be altered or changed. Jesus said, heaven and earth may pass away, but my words shall not pass away. The word of God shall not pass away. The word of God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Muhammad is the seal of the prophets when it comes to the prophecies of the word of God. And in the Holy Quran, it says that Adam was the caliph, and then it says that David and Solomon were the caliphate. The caliphate of the holy religion of Islam is the Jewish throne line of King David that Muhammad upheld when he worked with the Exarch Bastani, even during his lifetime. And when Omar went out on the Thursday catastrophe and said we should elect the caliph, he broke the covenant. Ali was not the caliph. Ali was the first imam. The Davidic king was the caliph, who was in the community of the Ummah of the Prophet Muhammad, and he said he was a member of the Ahlul Bayt, the family of Abraham. These four faiths, like four dead birds, are resurrected when they accept the covenant of Abraham, which continues from Adam to Abraham to David, down through the throne line of Davidic kings to Baha'u'llah and abdulbaha. This is the resurrection of the dead. This is the resurrection of the four Abrahamic faiths that will bring peace to the world, because the religious leaders of these faiths have no right to tell the secular government people of the world how they go about doing their business. The religious leaders of these four birds of the four Abrahamic faiths are obligated by the everlasting covenant of God to report to other people what the true teachings are, so that they can overcome their insistent self and implement the divine peace plan that God himself has given. On the one hand, if we're secular, we don't believe in plagiarism. We give credit where credit is due. Einstein is the one who wrote E equals MC squared. Madame Curie worked with lead and radium, and she discovered the properties that have led to the development of nuclear physics and quantum mechanics on a practical level. We give credit where credit is due. There's only been one human being in the entire history of humanity, written recorded history for 6,000 years, who announced first that war should be made illegal, that slavery should be abolished, that men and women were equal, and that we should remove religious prejudices which are in the way of us electing the International Supreme Tribunal. And it was his idea to elect a Council of the Nations, so nations would stop trying to rule the world over each other. Genius, genius. This man is Bahaullah, and he's influenced the last century. War was made illegal, like he said it should, after he said so in 1928. And his Supreme Tribunal's been imitated 3 times with a headless monster, one on Mount Carmel, so 4 if you want to count it. None of them's been able to bring peace to the world. None of them is set up correctly to prevent war from happening in the first place. And because of the insistent self being involved in corrupting how it could be elected democratically by all the people in the countries, and fairly, and not rigged for East against West or West against East or North against South, it has to be done in this way. And so when we look back at the 100 years, we see that he's the source of this. Well, when they asked him, you're a genius, what a great thing, he's not a plagiarist either. He said it wasn't his idea. He said, Baha'u'llah said, this is not my idea. He says, this is God's plan. That's why they imprisoned him, because he claimed the idea came from God. If he would have said it just came from himself, then they wouldn't have banished him. But because he wasn't a liar and he said he didn't think it up, he said, I was a man just like others and the breeze blew over me. And then he received this revelation. It's an amazing revelation. The revelation is fantastic. It's life-giving. It's stimulating. It's educational. No one person is going to stand in between us and this spiritual outpouring. And God sent Moses and Jesus and Buddha and Krishna and Zoroaster and Muhammad, the Bab and the indigenous founder to prepare the way for this, to give us spiritual teachings so we can become mature human beings, and to develop the intellect, prophecies, so we can recognize the one when he comes. The leaders of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the spiritual leaders, continue to promote the spiritual teachings of those manifestations for the growth and spiritual development of the individuals, including themselves, and their intellectual development. And they have an obligation in the covenant of God as clergy or leaders in those faiths to say, yes, our holy books prophesy that there will be a house of the Lord, that we will have a peace on earth, and here they are in the scriptures, and we are in favor of electing the supreme tribunal that Baha'u'llah has revealed to us from our own standpoint of being Christians, Jews, Buddhists, or Hindus, or Native American, or something else. They can all agree that this is what the purpose of God would like for us when it comes to the narrow concept of how we're going to manage global material things, by giving the people who are in charge of that correct spiritual guidance so they can figure out on their own how to implement these things in their genius, which is governance, as opposed to healing or science or art. And that's our role, purely educational, purely removal of prejudice to get the people to cooperate. The Iranians will govern Iran. The Russians will govern Russia. The Iranian government wants to be Shiite in its understanding, great, but it still has to uphold the First Amendment, which it does to a certain extent, with no compulsion in religion, by accepting the other religious groups that are beneficial to the Iranian government, like the Christians, the Jews, and the Zoroastrians. Now, it would be nice if we got to the point where Hindus and Buddhists and indigenous people can be accepted too, and we can understand the operation of the one true invisible God by sending various teachers to many different peoples. If the government upholds freedom of speech and freedom of education and freedom of religion, even if the government is Shiite or Catholic or secular or whatever it is, if it upholds this, the people are free to become spiritual and use their intellect to investigate the truth of the foundation of the religion. If this non-draconian thing was set up, nobody can deny that the covenant of the Prophet Muhammad comes down through the Ithna Ashari, and that Jafar al-Sadiq's the founder of all the faiths. But because they hate this country because they're not Sunni, or they're not Christian, or they don't like these people because they're Jewish, and they're all emotional, nobody's using their intellect. Stress, crisis, war, being threatened to be damned, things like this stir up the passion in a person that activates their reptilian brain, that shuts down their executive function in their frontal lobe. And then they can't use their intellect to ascertain the reality of these things. And also, if somebody else's religion is true, it doesn't mean that the other person's religion is false. The fact that Judaism is true doesn't make Islam false. The fact that Islam is true does not make Christianity false. In fact, the tawheed between the manifestations of God is absolute. They talk about the ones who came before them. They talk about the ones who will come after them. People that are mature will use their intellect when it comes to spiritual and religious concerns. And the greatest spiritual and religious concern we have, and by religion, we mean uniting people, is to elect the Supreme Tribunal, That is the greatest religious act that human beings can perform. Once we elect this thing, we'll be able to coordinate our affairs globally without interfering with each other, and we can go back to healthy competition between the nation states. I mean, I've been waiting my whole life to see a soccer game between Israel and Palestine. That would be a good game. But we're not going to see this if everybody's still fighting. The other ridiculous thing about all this is in the Holy Quran, it says specifically that the land of that area is given to Bani Israel. It's the land of the 12 tribes. It says this in the Holy Quran. If I was a Muslim, why would I object to Bani Israel being back in that area that Muhammad said belongs to them? See? Well, Bani Israel was 14 tribes. The 12 sons of Jacob plus the 2 sons of Joseph makes 14. Ephraim, Manasseh, Joseph, and the other ones, 14 tribes. Well, when Solomon and them broke the covenant and Nebuchadnezzar came in from Babylon and destroyed their society, before that, in 721 BC, the Shalmaneser III, this is recorded in a black obelisk and in archaeology, captured the 10 northern tribes of Israel and brought them into captivity. Well, he was from Assyria, and they governed the area of Iran and Iraq and that whole part of the Middle East. Well, these masses of people that were from the 10 tribes were all Jewish. Now, they were still, like I've said before, the tribe of Issachar or Gad or Asher, but they were intermarried with the women of the tribe of Judah, and that's why they were related by blood to Judaism, which is why the rabbis say, if your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. This is why. So these people that were all related to King David, even though they were in the 10 other tribes and identified by those names like Asher, Issachar, they were taken by the Assyrians. Well, they converted to Zoroastrianism and Islam down through the ages, and they intermarried with everybody. Everybody in that whole region, from Turkey all the way down into Egypt, swathing through the Middle East, all the way up through Pakistan toward India, are all the bloodline descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Some of them moved back to Syria and relocated there. So these people that we call the Palestinians, they're not Palestinian at all. Palestine, the name Palestine as a word comes from Philistines, from the Bible, the Philistines. And the Philistines were not a native indigenous people to the Middle East. They were a Greek colony that set up 5 cities on the coast where the Levant is, near the area of Jerusalem. And they were harassing all of the Middle Eastern people that had their own Eastern culture of understanding God the way they understood it. And the Philistines had a fish god that people argue about called Dagon that they worshiped. And eventually they were destroyed. These people today who were living in the Holy Land with their ancestors at the time of Bahaullah and abdulbaha, they're the physical descendants of the 10 lost tribes. This is ridiculous that they converted to Islam and Zoroastrianism during the ages. This isn't the state of Judea. It doesn't say in the Quran that Judea, the Jews, and just Judah has the right to those lands. It says Bani Israel. These people are Jewish. In fact, the whole world's Jewish. According to the Bible, Jewish means from the tribe of Judah, and I'm talking genetically. According to the Bible, God would number the physiological descendants of Abraham and the spiritual successors like the sands of the sea and the stars of heaven. Then it says the same thing with King David. David had many sons and many daughters. One of them was Solomon. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. These descendants of David and Solomon intermarried with all the people of the world. A man from Spain wrote a book showing how almost everybody in all of Europe is descended from King David, from some of the royal families that moved there around 800 AD when a Jewish princedom was set up in feudal France. And then we had the Jews were in France, the Ukraine, and Manzander in Iran, where you'd come down into the Middle East. Instead of traveling from Europe through Turkey to get in there, they would go from France up through the Ukraine and down where Iran is and back over to avoid the war conflicts and other things. And there was an international trade route that went through there, similar to the Silk Route. So people are unaware of our own history and where we've come from and what God's plan is in the evolution of society. For sure, for absolute sure, with the internet, with people learning how to read and write, they didn't do this at the time of Muhammad or the high priests or David or Moses or Jesus. Few people knew how to read and write. Today, it's the majority of people that can do this. We've reached the time in humanity's evolution of maturity, of spiritual maturity. And the sign of the growth of that spiritual maturity is we're mature enough for Russia, the United States, England, and France, just focusing on the Christians, to be mature enough to be charter members to elect the Supreme Tribunal correctly, fairly. So when the other nations see what the contracts are and the rights that are guaranteed and how we're endowed with by our Creator, who's invoked with unalienable rights to be spiritual and to live our lives as good citizens in the service of all humanity, they will join it also. But they should be mature enough to do this. Instead, they're playing these silly games about expanding NATO and taking over the Ukraine and frightening smaller countries that can't stand up to these big superpowers that have these sophisticated thermonuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, and other exotic technologies. Why are we in this predicament? When Ruia Khanum separated from Mason Remy, the entire UN IMF system that Abdulbaha's son and Showqi Effendi were guiding the people of the world to Baha'i teachings, and the people of that generation implemented it in the way that they understood it that way at that time. When they separated from the guidance of the Baha'i covenant, the leadership of the world doesn't know how to coordinate its activities in the changing climate. And they certainly aren't recognizing us as a voice crying out in the wilderness, which means wildness. And look at the wildness of the nation states, to become firm in this covenant of 1928, which is what they need to. It's the Bahais. We're entered into a covenant with bahaullah to stay in the covenant of 1921 to continue the Baha'i work of guiding the people to understand that God, the invisible God, is what is the real government of this planet. These people that think they have power and they're ruling the earth are wrong. It's God that's doing this. The fact that these scenarios are prophesied of in the book of Revelation, behold, a red horse, Russia was the Reds, given a great sword, the Sardar, Satan II missile, to take peace from the earth, that Gog and Magog, Juj and Majuj, would have hooks put in their mouth and dragged into the valley of Ham and Gog because of the encroaching of NATO. And this would become the valley of burying the dead for 7 months, shows that God is absolutely knowledgeable in how the people will be guided through his fashioning to look back at the first 100 years of how he failed to implement Baha'u'llah's peace program. And they will then figure out how to implement it. That's where we're at now. You don't have to be a Baha'i to acknowledge the fact that Baha'u'llah's peace program is the solution for how to manage the material affairs of the earth without everybody being a Baha'i. I mean, but this is from Baha'u'llah, not me. He said that they should deepen and come into the connection of their own indigenous faith and tradition and tap into God that way, and to turn unto God and to be consecrated to God so we can be spiritual to elect this supreme tribunal. So like I said, it said the zeal of his father's house will consume him. This is consuming all of our time and energy. It's been the main thing that's been consuming the Baha'i teaching effort for the last 100 years. And I would like to also add concerning the future of the faith that it says teaching. It doesn't say conquering. It doesn't say setting up cities. It doesn't say invading and expanding the Baha'i empire. It says teaching. That's all this is. If the Bahais of the world were meant to be an army of little abdulbahas living in their town, teaching that we should turn unto God, working at soup kitchens, becoming school teachers, getting jobs, fulfilling Baha'u'llah's purpose he gives us to carry on an ever-advancing civilization. An ever-advancing civilization doesn't mean the ever-advancing expansion of NATO. It doesn't mean the ever-advancing expansion of building Baha'i temples in the name Baha'i in all these countries. No, no, no. It means an ever-advancing education of civilization, deepening in the spiritual civilization that this thing is founded on. These questions about Baha'i government and Baha'i rulership and Baha'i armies and ruler in the world are all coming from the wrong point of view. They're coming from the point of view of control, power, manipulation, of nafs samara, of the insistent self. And nafs samara, Amer, is against Olami Amer, the revelation of God. And that's the conflict. When God gives his will, Amer, and we have our own selfish will, Nafsi Amar, we have a religion. Now the Christians, they have mostly in most of the sects, they're still true Christians, they have a religion about Jesus. It's a religion about Jesus. Jesus is the central figure of the religion, but they don't practice the religion of Jesus, unless they do. And the religion of Jesus is what he said in his second prayer that he revealed, or his other prayer, at the Rock of Agony, where he says, "Oh, Father, take this cup from me," before his crucifixion. Then he says, "Nevertheless, O Lord, not my will, O Lord, but thine." He surrendered and submitted his will to the will of God. That's what his religion is. And in Arabic and Hebrew, or Aramaic rather, this is Islam. This is not my will, O Lord, but thine. That's the first religion. The first thing a person does is submit their will to the will of God. Now, beyond this, they become like a true Christian as a believer. In the Quran, he said, just surrender. You know, they said, Muhammad, we're believers. He says, don't say you're believers. Say you've surrendered. So Islam doesn't mean a person has to be a believer in the religion of God. It just means they've surrendered their will to the will of God. So the Baha'is were unable to be Muslim about this and simply accept Mason Remy as the next president or the first president of the UHJ. They wouldn't surrender their will, Naf Samara, to the will of God, Olami Amer. And of course, the president of the House of Justice is the, Wali Amrullah, the guardian of the Amer, the cause of God. So this Amer is something that guides the Naf Samara to say, not my will, O Lord, but thine, and become spiritual. That's the whole point. There's nothing else. It's just a matter of the person figuring out for themselves how they can have that spiritual connection. Once that happens, the book is for them. Those people who are doing this are the members of the Holy Family. By accepting the covenant, all the people of the world will be members of one holy family, the family of mankind. And as far as material government goes, it is what it is. And they will elect an international council to settle their disputes. What is the resistance in electing this international council? It's prejudice, nationalism, racism, religious prejudice, and so forth. These things are in the way. So the Baha'i faith doesn't want to go out. And so the purpose of the true education of the Baha'i faith is to remove these veils. The Sans Guardians are going out and creating more religious prejudice by creating another religion in the world. The world doesn't need another religion. The world has plenty of religions. And they work for turning the individual to a spiritual being in the image of the Creator, the way they understand it.